I just want to make an administrative note before we start that our speaker today, due to good fortune, or at least she argues her friend from Murphy's Law, that she is scheduled to give a talk very shortly after this one at a conference in Canada. So we're going to have a pretty hard stop at 1:20 p.m. So I apologize for that. If you have any outstanding questions after your talk, I'm sure I can put you in contact with her. As usual, my name is Derek Fong. Welcome to our seminar series this quarter on wildfires. We are so grateful for the support of the Bill Lane Center for the American West, Stanford Sustainability Data Science, as well as the Woods Institute for making this series possible. I am excited for today's talk, and I'm extremely pleased to actually have, I guess, a Stanford alum, I guess we'll call it, Professor Maria Santos with us today from the University of Zurich. Her research focuses on understanding the coevolution of social ecological systems, on how to reduce impacts of anthropogenic change on species and ecosystem distributions while maintaining livelihoods. To answer these questions, she focuses on species and ecosystems and how they've evolved in time and space, and how conservation actions and policies interplay with one another. Her research incorporates a variety of methods, including field methods, GIS, remote sensing, statistical modeling, historical archival research, and conservation planning. Last week, of course, we talked with Michael Warrow about sort of more of a California issue, but I hope you will get the impression, if you didn't know already, that this is a global problem we're talking about in this series. I should also note that Maria holds a PhD in ecology from UC Davis, and as I mentioned earlier, she was a postdoctoral scholar with the Bill Lane Center for the American West at Stanford. Today, she will share with us some much-needed insights on the interaction between humans, ecosystems, and wildfires. Her talk is entitled Fire as a Social Ecological System. Please welcome Professor Maria Santos, and I will stop sharing my screen so you can take over, Maria.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And I hope you can hear me okay. Good. So today, first of all, thank you very much for this invitation to talk to you about how can we use a social ecological system perspective to understand fire. Let me start by some pictures from 2017 from my own country back in Portugal. Mediterranean type ecosystems like California, we had some mega fires that were unpredictable and that had disastrous consequences, with over 100 lives being taken away from the fire. This is some of the pictures of what we observed in the media in 2017, where people got trapped in between the fires and the fire escaped and were unable to run from the fire and were unable to deal with the fire. And this was a massive shock for the country, but also get us back to the perspective of fire. At the time, I got asked to talk to the business newspaper back in Portugal to talk about the perspective from an earth system science point of view and from a social ecological system point of view. I'm sorry, this is in Portuguese. But to talk about what can we actually do in terms of fire. And basically the main point that I mentioned in this interview was that we need to start learning how to work with the fire and not against the fire. And so with that in mind, that's kind of the foundation of this talk. And I'll give you a little bit of the current understanding of fire, but also how can we use a social ecological systems perspective to work with fire and not against it. We know a lot about fire. Fire is a fundamental process in the Earth system. These graphs here depict what we know in terms of fire recurrence, in terms of global fire patterns. What we see in the top graph is like what are some patterns in terms of more or less vegetation, burning, and how does that get changed as we have industrialization, changes in societies, and changes in human encroachment into natural habitats. We see here also, in comparison to fire regimes, oxygen in the atmosphere, and climate, and also what we know in terms of vegetation changes over time. The bottom graph tells us the influence of humans and what we have in terms of technology, both that leads to more fires, but also to the monitoring and understanding of fire. And we have, based on these records, we know that anthropogenic influences on fire activity have accelerated since industrialization, likely coinciding with what we call the Anthropocene. In this perspective, published in 2009 in Science, Bowman et al. Argue that at the time we need better models for fire. We need to understand fire distribution and diversity. We need to understand the effect of climate and human drivers of fire. We need to understand fire, climate, and carbon interactions, but also, and perhaps most importantly, fire feedbacks and how they actually pan out when we think about the interaction between vegetation, climate, and humans in the outcome that is fire. But this has been hampered by certain aversions, both disciplinary, but also understanding and our relationship with fires. Here's a map of a predicted fire occurrence in the number of fires that occur globally in different geographies. What we can observe from this map, and sorry for the quality of the map, but that's what the publication produced. So basically in warm colors, you see areas of the world and geographies that have likely more fire counts per year. And in darker colors, you see areas of the world that have fewer fire counts per year. So we know, based on this, that fire is part of many of the natural regimes of much of our global south, but also in many regions of temperate and northern latitudes. Because fire is so important for the Earth system, the Earth system has also evolved in the presence of fire. We have vegetation that have adapted to fire, that cannot persist without the presence of fire, and we all as humans require fire for our livelihoods. But what is new is that we're changing the fire. We're changing the fire frequency, the fire extent, and large and frequent fires are now the new normal. And this is likely because there is embeddedness between human infrastructure and flammable vegetation, requiring that in order to understand fire as the new normal, we need to cross across different disciplines, and we need to integrate fire as a system. So we can borrow a framework to start thinking about how do we go about thinking of fire as a system. This is a social-ecological systems framework that was proposed by Nobel Prize in Economy, Elinor Ostrom, in late 2000s, that basically depicts how can we understand ecological or environmental processes in relation and with feedbacks to human and social processes. And what she presented in this conceptual diagram is that from a human point of view, we have resource unities and resource systems that are provided by environmental systems such as ecosystems. And then we have users of certain resources and a governance system that aims at controlling the use of these resources by humans. And there are interactions and outcomes of these two types of processes that occur on the natural and on the social domain. And if we think about fire, it is a resource for humans, but it's also a disturbance that affects both humans. So if we think about this system's perspective, we can start to place where we start hypothesizing how can we use such a conceptual framework to start to think about how can we work with fire. So if we think about this framework, so basically if we, just to explain it a little bit more in detail in the next 5 minutes or so. So what we want is to think about there's resource systems that, for example, ecosystems like forests provide, that provide harvestable units, and that they have historically provided resources for humans and human occupation. fire in fire-dominated forests, for example, some of the Mediterranean type of forests that you experience in California, that I experience in Portugal. Fire is important for maintaining the vegetation, to maintain these forests, and therefore the ecosystem services or the nature contributions to people that these forests provide. These users are attracted by these conditions to forests. We all like to experience forest, either for their aesthetic values, for their recreation values, but also for livelihoods for many people in terms of what they can obtain from forests. However, if we think about too many users, maybe we can think about over exploitation, or in the case of fire, we may think about too many users in the forest may lead to more ignition of forest fires. And then in this context of the social-ecological system, we have governance, and we have a socio-economic and political setting that allows us to understand how this fire, for example, gets played out with different political decisions across different sectors, being it forestry or agriculture or water or nature protection. Or we can think about how fire actually affects not just forests, but other related ecosystems, either by burning into other ecosystems or because of the succession that happens when a given ecosystem gets burned. So this governance system is a way that we can, in some ways, institute some sort of interventions that we can think about how can humans, as users of forests and as drivers of fire, be actually working with fire and thinking about new ways to manage fire. So from a social ecological system point of view, we're thinking about the system. So what does this mean in terms of a system? So for systems, what you see on the left-hand side are what are the different constituents of a given system. So a system needs components, and in a social ecological system, we're talking about people and other organisms and the fluxes between them, which we could call them ecosystem services. Fire is an ecosystem service in a way. We have relations. They can be relations by what we do as humans in the given ecosystem, and these relations can be through land tenure or land use or management, etc., etc. We have a system memory because a system operates under certain conditions. It's dynamic, and this memory can be ecological. So if we think about fire, if something burns, so are there a seed source where the new ecosystem or the same ecosystem is going to emerge after the fire, or from the social point of view. So if we have certain policies that install, for example, a no-burn policy, that will create a certain system memory until the system recovers its dynamics or changes its dynamics forever. And then we have regimes. So this interplay between the social and the ecological drivers in these dynamic systems creates different regimes. We can think about different fire regimes, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then through this analysis of the connection between components, through their relations, the memory, and how the regimes might emerge, we can start to understand whether a system is resilient. And that's ultimately the goal that we want to have. And if we want to think about how can we work with fire, we want to know whether through either social or ecological changes, we can enable system resilience to both maintaining fire, which is fundamental, and social processes that occur in fire-dominated landscapes. Yet, so if we think about this perspective of a fire as a social ecological systems, we need to know quite a few things. So I've already told you from a systems perspective what we actually need to know. So we need to know what's the fire activity, what's the traditional fire activity over long periods of time. So if we want to depict the system and we want to know certain compartments and certain relationships between the different compartments that explain fires, so that we can actually predict what are fire regimes and how can these fire regimes emerge or not with changes in human use of our ecosystems. So several authors have been puzzled about how do we actually understand fire. If we look into the components of the system, the left-hand side graph is an ecological model that looks at fires in 3 different regions of the world: Mediterranean systems, tropical systems, and boreal systems. And they developed a very simple model where you have different types of plant functional types, so being it trees or shrubs or grasses, and they try to predict with different types of thresholds and parameters what kind of system will emerge after different types of fire regimes. And so basically what they show is that in Mediterranean systems, we always, irrespectively of the changes in the fire regime, we always converge into an oak-dominated system. But if we move into tropical or to boreal systems, what you see with the multiple colors on the left-hand side graph is that there's different types of stable states that might emerge with different fire regimes of different intensities. And then on the right-hand side, what we can start to see is like, okay, so on the rightmost part of the graph is the farther away in time. So we had natural fire regimes that created that were the first fires, and that you see there also the first plants, and you see how the plants started to evolve alongside with these first fire regimes. And then if you move from the right-hand side towards the left, you start to see evolution of processes such as grass and fire cycles, such as in African savannas. And then you have hominid-fire interactions. You start to emerge with agricultural fire, much closer to where we are now, so natural and human influence fires. And now we are in a new era where we have a lot of human-created fires as well. So we're starting to observe an increasing change in human nature fire interactions, and we also have modern industrial fire that has expanded the drivers of fire regimes globally. If we think about the relations between these different components, so we know there's people, organisms, and fires that are very coupled. And here, if we structure it by different biomes, what we can start to think about is, okay, so if there is this clear threshold that fire regimes change quite substantially post-industrially, for all the biomes, what you can see more generally, if you look into the middle column, you basically see that most of the drivers in pre-industrial fire regimes, they are natural drivers. They're about dry seasons, tree densities, infrequent fires with wet periods. It's all about building up of fuel. It's all about moisture content. It's all about natural succession. However, if you spend some time looking into the right-hand side, what you see is very clearly land use changes. So you see, for example, for tropical rainforest, a switch to flammable grassland or agricultural fields. For tropical savanna, heavy grazing. For mid-latitude deserts, you see introduction of flammable grasses. Mid-latitude North American seasonal dry forest, fire suppression. And in boreal forest, you have global warming, but also treeless vegetation. So what we see here as we go into the post-industrial fire regime is that land use changes, and the effects of human management on the landscape has affected irreversibly the fire regimes. So we have to acknowledge that this has a strong effect, and therefore we're now, if we look from the left-hand side to the right-hand side on the progression of what has become important for fires, we used to have natural ignitions, the amount of biomass and the oxygen in the atmosphere in very long time ago. We started to have more fire weather and starting to have human ignitions. And now we are kind of a bifurcation. We have on one hand climate change that affects fuel, moisture, fuel accumulation and modification, but we also have policies such as fire suppression and suppression of wildfires that together create very different regime. Or on the other hand, we have some sort of controlled environment, but we also have a lot of industrial and domestic anthropogenic driven fire that could be a completely different type of regime. So if we want to think about how to live with fire and how to work with fire, we need to consider that there are two pathways now for the way that fires actually operate. So if we think from a dynamic point of view of how do we actually model fire, there's lots of important variables that can be extracted. Just to give you some examples. So what we know is that wind speed, fuel continuity, fuel loads, fuel moisture, and fire variable are very, very important for predicting fire. But what we don't know is about the feedbacks. It's about the resilience of the system. And so this is where we need to start to examine what kind of feedbacks are there between fire-prone ecosystems and people, so that we can start to learn how to live with fire. So to tackle some of these problems, I come from a remote sensing laboratory, so we have some technology that help us to start to think about how do we deal with all of these components at the same time. So if we take the social ecological system framework that I was explaining, and if we focus on governance solutions, because what we want is to think about interventions on how do we actually live with fire. So one of the reasons to use this framework is that it actually allows us to understand what we call appropriation and provisioning dilemma. So appropriation is how much we take of the system, provision is how much we provide to the system to solve a given interaction between a human and a natural resources. So in order to understand these dilemmas, they work best if we think about a system that has clearly defined boundaries between the users and the resources, that this system is aligned with the local conditions, and that there's some sort of collective choice arrangements that can be made. Let's zoom in into Mediterranean type ecosystems that we are all familiar with, being in California or in many different types of the world. There's basically 5 locations of the world that have very similar climatological conditions that they are called Mediterranean type climatologies or Mediterranean type ecosystems. The Mediterranean basin, as the name indicates, but also California, Chile, South Africa, especially the Cape Town, and Southwestern Australia. They all show what this Imberg diagram shows, that is high precipitation in the winter months and high temperature during the summer months that creates conditions favorable for Mediterranean type vegetation to evolve and to persist in these types of systems. Mediterranean type vegetation basically evolved along 2 axes that you can think about. So either nutrient availability, so on the top is high nutrient availability, on the bottom is low nutrient availability, and an axis of aridity. So if you have higher aridity, you evolve into a desert shrubland. With greater moisture, you have sclerophyllous woodlands, such as those that you find in California. And then if you have high rainfall, you can have coniferous and deciduous vegetation. But one characteristic that is very important of Mediterranean type of ecosystems is that most of them are actually working landscapes. So we have centuries in Europe, for example, of human encroachment into these landscapes through the management of fire. In California, you could also argue that there are centuries of fire management through native groups. And you have the same in other locations of Mediterranean type of systems. So when we think about fire as a social ecological system, and if we think about what kind of governance options we have, well, it's a little bit difficult to set up what are the clearly defined boundaries, because fire doesn't really comply to this idea of boundaries. So let's zoom in into my birthplace, the area that I looked into the most. So we have also oak woodlands that like you have in California, but in this case, they are cork oak and holm oak woodlands. And basically we can start to see through use of remote sensing data, whether we can actually detect fire regimes and changes in fire regimes. So here's a time series from May 2000 until December 2001 on NDVI, which is the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, that shows basically the productivity of the system. What is important here, so anything above 0 is some sort of vegetation status. Higher than 0.5 is very high productive vegetation. But what you see here is that in this region here, there was a fire. So the first thing that we want to be able to see is, like, can we detect fires in different time series? So in both oak woodlands and in the dry croplands such as these, we can use these types of technologies to start to detect fires. But then if we expand the time series, so I showed you a little bit from 2000, just the first couple of years, so we can, but now we have a larger archive of satellite data, and we actually can start to look into these patterns and see where are the fires and what is the response of vegetation to those fires. So we see here that we find in the time series that there are changes in productivity, and then post the fire, they are mostly linked to changes in relatively humidity. But then, because we're thinking about a social ecological system, Katerina, that is depicted here, she conducted some surveys, and she asked people, okay, so after the fire, what did you do? Did you stop harvesting? Did you change your activities? And the answers were no, we did not change the harvesting activities. But what they showed is that most of the people that actually were starting to harvest were not actually people that lived within the system, but people that lived in the city, and then they came just for the harvesting, and they continue harvesting because fire was not affecting them directly. Most of the respondents, especially the local ones, they basically showed that yes, the fire led to low tree health, low core quality, and more shrubs, and changing in practices, but that didn't really affect who actually was benefiting from this system, because these are people that were coming from somewhere else. So if one of the conditions in order to obtain a functioning social ecological system is to have this provisioning and appropriation rules that are congruent with local social and environmental conditions, for the case of Portugal, that was not the case. So we see that that system is not working because we have a lot of outsiders coming in and affecting how the local social and ecological conditions are being balanced. So the local harvesters, they knew what the conditions are and they were stopping their harvest, but the people that were coming from outside were not doing the same. So why does this matter? So this is the last almost 50 years of fire regimes in Portugal. So basically what we have examined for Portugal by looking into the registry of fires is that since 1975, so that's the end of the dictatorship, that's when we have actually registry of the fire regimes and the fire extent. Some authors have proposed that we have been through 4 phases of fire regimes. So the first one was between 1975 and 1985, small fire regimes in northern landscapes with small extents. And then between 1980s and 2002, an expansion that follows also the expansion of eucalyptus plantations and pine substitution of these oak woodlands. And then from 2002 to 2018 or 2016, a further expansion further south to the country. And then, as I started off with the 2017 fires, we saw massive fire occurring in very unprecedented climatic conditions in the country. So with this, we conclude that there's a new fire regime happening in the country and that we need to start adapting the way that people locally and externally are affected by fires. We are now in 2023, We have now much better monitoring capabilities. This comes from Global Forest Watch that tells us what is the current status of aridity in the Iberian Peninsula. So this is the difference in NDVI, so this productivity metric that I was talking about from the average between 2000 and 2010. So what we see here is that actually the productivity, especially in the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula, is less than 30% or more than a negative decrease in 30% than the average in the beginning of the 2000s of the 21st century. So for Portugal, between the period of observation between 2012 and 2023, we had about 40,000 records of fire alerts. For Spain, which is about 3 times bigger than Portugal, in the same period, there were about 72,000 records of fire alerts. So we see an increased number of fire occurrence, and we see that the land use practices and the human interactions are not changing as we see this increased number of fires. So now let's get you to a place that is more familiar to you, to California. So when I was at Stanford, we actually examined a little bit the history of what happened in the state. We were interested in the conservation or the protection of open spaces. And one of the research assistants that was working with me, Salma, here, we looked into Los Angeles County. And we looked into Los Angeles County because it's a very interesting county when it comes to land use decision-making. There's more than 800 agencies and cities that actually dictate what is the land use, and there's a very big confusion, to call it nicely, of who actually gets to decide what happens to land within the boundaries of the county. So what you see here is the work that we were doing at the time. So anything in green depicts new protected areas that were established in that decade that is reflected in there. Anything that is in red is active fires that happened during that decade, and anything that is in brown is active fires from a previous decade that led a legacy into the ecosystem. So what you see is this big expansion on open spaces, especially in the mountains around LA, but you also see different fire emerging in the landscape, especially in the 1910s and the 1980s and the 1990s. So the question we were asking is like, okay, is this because we're protecting more land and we're allowing this land to be managed in a different way that is emerging these new fire regimes? So basically what we did is we looked into the decade of open space protection. So that's the top left graph, and the proportion of open space that was burned. And we see that this proportion is not correspondent to the decade that actually the open space was acquired. And then we look into the decade of the fire. So if we compare these two graphs, we see that the decades of fire don't correspond to the decades where we actually protected more land. And then the graph on the right-hand side, you see here the 0 mark. This is the amount of fire that happened before a given land was protected as open space versus the amount of fire that happened after a land was protected as open space. So this suggests that it's not so much the management that happened after the protection and after it becomes the open space, but that there's something about the social ecological interactions that happen in these regions that lead to different fire regimes. Another student that was working in our project was examining at the time we were gifted to the Stanford Libraries, the Burlow maps. That was a collection of AAA maps of roads since the 1930s, which you see here. The kind of turquoise lines are the roads that existed in 1930s, and the green are areas that were protected in the Bay Area in 1930s, and in gray were urban tissues in the 1930s. So what we did was to look into what is this encroachment of humans into the landscape. So that's what we were able to do. So that was 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s now, 1970s, and 2000s. So what you see also in the Bay Area where we had this is that we have a growing road network, growing built up area, and much further encroachment into the landscape and contact of urban wildland interface. So when we want to look into the future of what can we do in terms of fire as a social ecological system and how can we work with fire, one thing that we can think about is what kind of choices we make in terms of urban growth, for example. So if we see that urban growth is encroaching more and more into wildlands, what kind of future scenarios could we see? And so that's what we did. We ran an urban planning model for 3 scenarios for California. Business as usual, where the urban growth follows the current patterns. The infill, where we put higher population density within current urban fabric, and the climate connectivity, so it's a climate smart urban growth. And you see here the depiction of what the outcomes of the 3 scenarios are. So you see that in the infill scenario, urban growth for the same amount of population comes at less expense of new land being developed. In the case of business as usual, but also of climate connectivity, we see that urban growth will expand very much into this urban wildland interfaces, which will mean that in terms of the fire regime, we need to start to think about where we will develop these. So this focus on the social ecological system framework also allows us to think about the feedbacks that we could enable. So we can model where we would like to see urban growth, but we actually may want to know also where are the users moving into, what are they doing, what kind of resources could they use in these new normal fire regimes. So this is a little video that I would like to show you of how can we actually start to include some of these feedbacks. Let's see if I can make it work.
Fire, as a natural phenomenon, has played a critical role in the Earth system processes. This phenomenon has contributed to shaping human life in direct connection with the ecosystems. It influences vegetation distribution, carbon cycle, climate, and much more. However, in recent years, there has been a growing concern about wildfire recurrence and intensity, having catastrophic effects on the atmosphere and the environment, turning this natural phenomenon into an ecological, economic, and therefore societal problem. In this regard, 5 areas or biomes in the world, including Southern California, Central Chile, the Mediterranean Basin, South Africa, and part of Australia, and known collectively as Mediterranean Type Climate or MTC regions, are annually subjected to severe fires. The reason? There are multiple. However, climate has been identified as an important driver. MTC regions have cold, mild wet winters combined with hot, dry summers. Moisture content of living and dead plants is reduced, increasing the likelihood of ignition and spread. A second reason is the type of vegetation. Different vegetation types coexist in these biomes, from woody vegetation and grasses to oak woodlands and conifer forest. Some of these plants have adapted to fire, therefore they are classified as fire-prone or fire-tolerant species, and some of them even require fire to exist. There is a complex and non-linear relationship between fire, vegetation, and climate. Therefore, it is crucial to understand how vegetation dynamics in the presence of recurrent fire and climate change scenarios may respond. Some ecosystems recover after wildfires faster than others. Some may react gradually or in sudden ways, switching from their stable state to another stable state. This implies that some ecosystems can be in more than one stable state for a given environmental condition. This is called alternative stable state. Recently, wildfires in combination with drier environmental conditions have been started to be analyzed for the Mediterranean basin, showing that the combination of aridity and fire could lead the Mediterranean basin forest to an alternative shrubland state. A similar situation might be happening in other areas of the world, such as in California. This research project aimed to assess the effects of fire in combination with aridity in the long term by simulating vegetation dynamics under the influence of fires and aridity in Los Padres National Forest, Southern California. 5 representative species were chosen, including an oak, pine, and shrubs. We consider how fast they spread, how long they live, seeding survival, different levels of flammability and aridity, and more. After an intense model simulation, part of our results are as follows. This graph represents the percentage of plant cover as a function of time for the 5 plant species. Firstly, the model was run without fire under historic conditions and over a period of 10,000 years. Different aridity scenarios were included. As seen, the oak or Quercus spp in blue became the dominant species on the long term. When fire was included, our results changed. Each discontinuity in the lines indicates that a fire occurred. The frequency depended on the plant community composition. The results showed that all the vegetation species co-occur and the system converged equally to an oak forest. As fire was combined with increasing aridity levels, the system presented a shift of vegetation and a shrub dominance appeared. This can be seen from the purple and yellow lines, which represent the dominance of 2 shrub species. The plant composition on the 48 aridity scenarios is depicted here. Bars represent average plant cover under different scenarios. 3 aspects are underlined. On the bottom x-axis, we find increasing flammability levels. On the y-axis, we see decreasing oak resprouting ability. On the top x-axis, decreasing values of oak colonization. In panels B, C, D, and H are shown the scenarios where an alternative shrubland state may happen. To conclude, oak species remain dominant under fire and no-fire scenarios. Aridity by itself was not able to destabilize the oak dominance. Alternative stable state may occur when both fire and aridity are combined. The hypothesis for this work might be true based on previous results. However, due to time constraints, several parameters were taken from the Mediterranean basin model, which might be different for the Californian conditions. Calibration and validation still remain to be done in this research.
So basically, I was telling you about, can you see the new screen now? So I was telling you about how the system has evolved over time and how different characteristics might emerge. So now it's the time to think about the future. So I've showed you some results of projecting where urban environments could happen and where human population could be moving into. What we know from the ecological conditions, as Elba's work showed, is that there are 3 axes of importance. So the flammability, the type of plant cover that we have, and the amount of oaks that might be persistent in the landscape. In California, what we know up to now in terms of urban development, a lot of the oak distribution areas were preserved. So we still have quite a bit of oak remaining, and therefore, if the future developments of urbans are to follow the same trend, we should be able to maintain the oaks, which are extremely resilient to aridity, but most importantly, to fire regimes. So what we're doing now is to actually take this model a little bit further, and we're expanding it to bring it about better ways to actually parameterize the model. So the model can be described as having a need for 5 parameters, and I will just briefly explain what they are. Competition index is which species get to compete and outcompete others. The colonization rate and mortality rate, they are self-explanatory. What's the flammability of a given species or plant functional type, and what is the type of fire response that these plant functional types actually have. So when we think about this type of model, we can think about, okay, so what kind of data can we use to parameterize this model? So what Mathilde depicted here was to use some data collected by airborne imaging spectroscopy. So some of the newest technology and data types that are emerging now from the remote sensing point of view, and testing it into an area in the Sierras that has experienced recurrent fires between 2013 and 2016. So we obtained the data that existed from 2013 to 2018 for this region, and we looked into different types of vegetation indices, as we call them, or different mathematical combinations between different reflectance properties along the electromagnetic spectrum that we know that reflect different types of properties, being it and we wanted those that could be reflecting the parameters that are important for this fire model. So what this graph here shows was just a way to select which of the indicators we could use to parameterize the model, because then we're moving from a spatial model to a spatial model, because we can then obtain these parameters spatially. So you see here the 5 parameters and the different indicators for the 6 time periods that we have data for. And then we can use these to inform the model and predict what happens in a short time frame, which is what we want to know for some of these more intense fire regimes. And so what I showed you from Elba's work was the left-hand side model, that over time we see this dominance of oaks. But then even if we parameterize the model with the short-term intervals, we still see that there is a dominance of this same oak state, even with, at least with the current fire regimes. So finally, just wanted to spend 3 or 4 minutes to think about the future. I gave you some ideas of what has happened in the Iberian Peninsula. We're experience more and more drought anomalies and new fire regimes. I showed you for California what are the projections in terms of urban development, but also what kind of forests and what kind of vegetation dynamics we might expect under varied fire regimes. But globally, we have established that fire is becoming the new normal, more frequent and more intense fires in all kinds of vegetation and all types of biomes. So this is important, especially if we think about which kind of population densities do we have in these areas that will become dominated by fire. So what this graph here shows is in the bottom is population density, on the y-axis is the night lights. And so the intersection between low population density and low night lights are depicted in purple. High population density and high night lights are depicted in yellow. And then anything in between is high population density and low night lights, and low population density and high night lights. What is interesting to also notice is that these areas that are with high population density and low night lights are areas that are very likely to be developed. And what we see is that they coincide with that first global map that I showed you of the number of times that fire frequencies tend to emerge. So we've been working a little bit with some of these landscapes and working with a dynamic vegetation model, looking into different biomes in the African continent. And this is the work of my PhD student, Abuiso, where we've been using LPG gas with a fire regime to look into what kind of fires we might be looking. We wanted to look into specifically 2 cases. That is, fire in these landscapes is also used to produce energy. A lot of the people that live in these areas that have the low night lights require charcoal or biomass-based types of energy. So it's very important to start to think about not just the natural fires, but the human ignition of fires in these biomes. And so we examine what kind of biomes could actually enable certain types of human extraction for energy and whether that had an effect on the fires. And so these are the different types of carbon influxes from a low charcoal extraction case or from a high charcoal extraction case, and whether it had actually implications for new fire regimes for this region. And then what we've actually been looking into is into projections of the future. So for these regions, we use the image model outputs for land use and land cover changes for the different shared socioeconomic pathway scenarios. The one on the left is the most sustainable future. The one on the right is the business as usual. Anything in red is extreme changes in land use and land cover change. Anything in green is revegetated or regenerated vegetation and natural ecosystems. So what we've been looking into Africa is what kind of land use and land cover change are we expecting to see? So mostly what we're expecting to see is large decreases in natural ecosystem extents, but at the expense of large increases of mostly pasture and croplands, but also some urban regions. So what are the implications in terms of the carbon fluxes in this area where we have to provide both energy, but also avoid fire regimes? So we see here that most importantly, if we are to manage land use change, we are able to actually control the carbon regimes based on both fire and land use changes. So in this presentation, I took you on a whirlwind tour of fire in the Earth system, and how can we use something like understanding social ecological system feedbacks to think about working with fire and not against fire. I gave you some examples from Mediterranean type ecosystems, but those are relatively small at a global level, and we start to see new fire regimes also occurring in many of the different biomes, in particular in biomes that unprecedentedly had fire regimes. We have observed that in Canada, we have observed those in boreal landscapes, but also very large magnitude fires all over the world. If we think about fire as a social ecological system, if you ask me, do we need to think about it in this way? Absolutely. Do we know what we need to do? Not yet, but we need much more information. I've showed you the role of like historical data. I've showed you the role of spatial relationships. I've showed you how we can use some different types of dynamic models, being it projections of urban development, being it projections of how plant communities develop under different fire regimes, being it the implications for carbon emissions into the atmosphere. We're at a phase where, irrespectively of what we can do in terms of tree planting and tree restoration, the large fires that we have experienced in the last decade have superseded in terms of new carbon emissions back into the atmosphere. So it is time really to focus and advance this understanding of fire as a social ecological systems. I showed you some examples of how we have been dealing with them, but looking forward to much more research within this area. And with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Maria, thank you so much. I know we're a little over time, but I'm hoping we can get you to have one question here before we have to have you sign off. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. I still have like.
And I think Bruce wants to give the question. See, he boldly popped up his camera. So I'm going to give Bruce sponsored part of this series. I'm going to let Bruce have the floor here.
Well, actually, I was just coming to show my face. But anyway, look, I'm kind of curious because you ended on a point that I wasn't quite clear about, which is your bottom line on this business of using vegetation for storage of carbon, which is a very important point. Is it, if we have, given the trend of increasing warming, should we be lowering our expectation of what we can store with vegetation across the world because of the nature of the warming? And if so, what do we have a sense of the magnitude of what we're losing in terms of storage if we go across all these different systems?
That's an excellent question. I don't know if we are resolved. What I know is that, so for quite some time in the last, let's say 20 years, the satellite records have shown the overall greening of the world. And that's what we call CO2 fertilization, because plant growth is limited by different factors, being it nutrients, being it water, being it radiation, being it CO2. More CO2 into the atmosphere meant more capability to uptake the CO2 into through the stomata and to produce photosynthesis. But there's what we call a law of diminishing returns. So at some point, that is no longer limiting. And at some point, either you run into limitations that are physiological. You have only so many proteins and photosynthetic apparatus that can work. So there's only so much you can actually uptake globally. And then other aspects that come into play are water limitation and nutrient limitations. Radiation, we're assuming that it's not a limitation, and temperature is also a problem. So what does it mean for water availability? So CO2 is discarded as a limitation, but in some systems where water becomes scarce, we will not have so much photosynthesis because we don't have the water to do the stomatal opening, and therefore we're going to stop or diminish the photosynthesis rate. If we don't have nutrients, is the same. So tropical systems, for example, are known for being phosphorus limited. And so if we run out of phosphorus available for plants, that will be a problem. Nitrogen is also dependent on mycorrhizal activity that also has a law of diminishing returns, and therefore that will be problematic. And then finally, temperature. We know that photosynthesis operates better within, I think, 32 and 36 degrees Celsius. So anything that is above that, basically what you have is the denaturation of the proteins that work in a photosynthetic system, and so you cannot really operate with photosynthesis. That's what we know. So do we know the net effect of all of this? Absolutely not. We know something. We know something in some systems. So we know some tropical systems that they are still sinks and not sources of carbon. We know for some temperate systems that have been very well monitored in terms of they are still sinks, but we don't know for several other ecosystems because of all the interplay of this. And then what we don't know is the ocean. We don't know what's the role of the ocean also on that part. We barely know any estimate of like chlorophyll at the surface of the ocean. We have very little Earth observation that allows us to understand that at the more detailed.
Well, I mean, I'm sure that's right, but I do think that the emphasis on offsets, people, it affects policy to know whether we should be encouraging more of these offsets. So hopefully you'll try to combine all these things and come up with some numbers for us.
We would like to, yes. So that's one of the things that we're doing with this model for Africa, but we're trying to expand it to other regions. It's like, okay, where can we actually increase density of vegetation and see if that actually has some impact. So now we're decreasing, we're just taking it out for charcoal and energy, but now we have a new project on agroforestry for Africa of like, where would this be a good system to have?
Well, Maria, that's really sobering, and I appreciate your honesty. I wish you just came up with a solution that we can take to all the policymakers and enact them. I know we're running out of time in terms of the planet, so I'm hoping these solutions or suggestions will come forth quickly. And I also, though, want to respect that you are out of time because you have to go give another talk very shortly. So I'm going to close things out for today. Thank you for those of you who stuck around for a little Q&A here. If you're going to come next week, I'd encourage you to come. We have buyers from a venture capital perspective. Bill Clarico is going to be with us next week, so I hope you can join us then. Thanks again, Maria. Good luck with your talk up there in Canada, and thank you for your time today. We'll see you all again next week.